We just wanted to know, what do panel members think about these columns or these titles as a suggested pathway as a means to career progression? Because there is discussion in this scope document about being able to move, I was going to say between categories, but presumably people would only want to move from up A towards C rather than the other way around. So yeah, what do people think about that as a potential career progression? Emma, if we could go to you first.
I'll keep it short because it more or less goes with what I said before, that I think it's a bit of a red herring, because career progression within an organisation as an employee would be about your experience unless certain qualifications become mandated within that organisation. And then in private practice, again, where would you be progressing to, and how would it change your clients that you can work with, unless that becomes mandated between the three columns? So again, that's where I think there's this conflation between training routes and what you would practice and your competence around that.
Okay, thank you. And I think it's important to note that this kind of does feel like maybe a change in terminology in terms of this version of the SCoPEd project compared to the first iteration that was released. Okay, Andy, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I suppose it's not just a change in terminology, is it? There's it shows the shift in. There's almost sort of an admittance that it's not, the project isn't mapping. It's trying to redefine the field in a way, and it's tried to answer a lot of queries about where would I fit if I can do this, and this, but I'm deemed at this level because of this part of my training or whatever. Yeah, so it just really highlights that hole in it again, I suppose. And it does this sort of movement thing between the, from A to C, does sort of suggest a kind of linear progression from sort of basic therapist to intermediate therapist and then advanced therapist, which I'm not sure really is the reality of practice, which to me, practice seems not about a kind of forward momentum, but a kind of a broadening out. It's a kind of deepening, which I don't think is captured through. And I found the case studies sort of baffling in a way of where you could be and what you could do, because it created this possibility that there will be ways for BAC. I mean, like myself, because I'm not accredited, I never have been. I've chosen to do other CPD activities, and it's just something that's never come my way. I've not seen it as important. I was fortunate enough to have paid work without it, which I'm aware can be really difficult. But yeah, it's kind of like, where do I sit? And then there seems to be this kind of real effort to sort of try and answer all these queries. Well, you could be here, you could be here, but how will you check that? And then the answer is, well, we haven't quite decided yet, but there's going to be things we're going to put in place to assess whether you got to this level or that level. But we don't know quite what they are yet, but we want you to approve this iteration and move the project forward, or get it done, in the words of the chair of the Psychoanalytic Council. So I just think that's, for one thing, is just the principle of sort of voting on something. Well, I know we're not voting, but like being asked to comment on something where we don't really know what's going to happen, and what how these gaps are going to be filled. But the gaps themselves just demonstrate what feels quite an absurd way of kind of describing the field, which is actually more complex than that. I mean, I'll leave it there because I know we're short of time.
No, that's great. There's some really important points in there. Thank you. Erin, move on to you.
There's a direct contradiction between what it says in the SCoPEd framework and what it says in the case studies. If anybody hasn't seen the case studies, if you go to the BACP website, if you go to the SCoPEd page where you can download the framework, I think it's bottom right hand corner, there's a link to the case studies, so you can see example A, I'm such and such, and if I do this, I'll get to be that. So in the SCoPEd framework, for client hours to be in different columns. For column B, it says 450 client hours, including hours gained after core training. And in column C, it says 450 hours minimum during training. So it makes a clear distinction between column B and column C, that column B can include post-qualification hours and column C can't. Yet the case studies seem to suggest that if you do an additional top-up course, which includes a mental health placement or familiarisation, that you can in fact move into column C from column B, presumably without the 450 minimum hours during core training. And that's a direct contradiction that I think really needs to be addressed. Again, like Andy was saying, I think it's really concerning that the BACP doesn't have mechanisms for recognising movement between B and C. So it doesn't have mechanisms for recognising these top-up courses. It also hasn't said where these top-up courses are going to come from, who's going to pay from them, how counsellors working in full-time private practice or full-time employment are going to find time to do mental health placements. And it also says that the BACP's main mechanism for movement between A and B is currently accreditation, but we would need to find other mechanisms for members who have chosen not to do accreditation. They've also said that these additional mechanisms wouldn't have a cost attached to them, which throws a question open as to what's the point of accreditation if you don't have to pay for this other mechanism that they're going to create in future. There's a lot of confusion, there's direct contradictions, and there's no clarity.
Okay, thank you. There was a lot of questions from therapists around this particular issue, and particularly there was some therapists I know who'd communicated with BACP who were asking for clarity around what would happen around these mechanisms in terms of moving up the tiers, if you like. And I know that there was some people who got fed back that the decision would be made after the framework was introduced, and I think that really raised a lot of people's anxieties around, you know, agreeing to something before they knew actually how it was going to operate and what was going to happen in that. Okay, Jay, if we could come to you.
I've got nothing in principle against people being able to gain, as I sort of said before, you know, gain badges of various kinds post-qualification. But I think once you're qualified, you're qualified. And I think, as Rima was saying earlier, that's like really the baseline. And that's what this kind of thing challenges, and what, you know, sort of accreditation and so forth is maybe kind of challenged, and this sort of volunteering culture and everything like that. You know, I think the message needs to be that once someone's qualified as a therapist, they're qualified. And if they want to gain additional badges, fine. But the main thing is that once you're qualified, you are qualified. And that also, in that, any additional trainings or continuing professional development, or indeed getting your own therapy, needs to be count fully. It shouldn't just be sort of certain BACP courses or whatever that count. And I think really it all should all be under a generic title, as again I think Emma was saying, you know, maybe like psychological therapist or something. But I know that a lot of people would maybe not want to be called a psychological therapist, and there'd probably be arguments about what that generic title would be. And that's what I think.
Okay, thank you. I think there'd be lots of discussions about what that title would be. Rima, can we come to you?
Yeah, I think the panel's pretty much covered it. I think, you know, if we're stepping away from this framework and thinking about one title, and, you know, you're qualified, that means you're qualified. So anything extra you do, you're doing sort of as from your choice, really. And as Jay was saying, sort of carrying on adding them badges, that's fine. And I think being in this profession, you're going to be in lifelong learning, because we'll never get to the point of knowing the human mind and behavior and emotions and everything that goes with it. So I think we're signing up to lifelong learning anyway. But I think my main issue with this is I think there needs to be more clarity around what happens to existing trainees and therapists, because we've paid for our training and we've signed up for what we wanted to sign up for. So I think if we're being asked to do anything extra, is that fair? You know, is that fair? I'm not sure it is. And I think that needs to be debated a lot more. So within this project, I think there needs to be a lot more voices heard about what will happen to existing therapists, and also new pathways for the new people coming into the profession.
Okay. Thank you, Rena. I'm sure the panel can see, but we've had so many comments throughout the discussion today. One of them that I just wanted to pick up on and just kind of throw it out there really was Fiona had identified, and she says, I'm paraphrasing, competency frameworks are used for recruitment, appraisals and promotion. Membership bodies are not employers. Any employers have their own competency framework, so why would membership bodies be trying to create their own? And I just thought that was an interesting point. Has any of the panel got any comments on that or anything else from that question before we move on?
I have a comment around it. I totally get what Fiona's saying, because obviously if you were an employed therapist within an organisation, you would be appraised against competencies and various things like that. But because of the discussions we're constantly having about, you know, counsellor versus psychotherapy and stuff, where I would be in support of a competency framework that all membership bodies use would be because of the disparity in training. But, you know, somebody trained at level 4 or at level 5, depending on what college they go to, would have been taught totally different things. So that's where, if membership bodies have this kind of competency framework that everybody could work to, again, I disagree with the columns. I think it could be much wider than that everybody could be assessed against whichever competency they choose to evidence. But then that would then bring some consistency amongst the profession, because if we're all assessed against the same set of competencies and have all achieved the same competencies, that then does give some level playing field in which you can get employed or whatever and say these are the competencies I've achieved as a professional.
So for you, Emma, it'd almost be like a generic set of competencies that we were all kind of adhering to, and that was set out that we were all required to do, rather than the current scope iteration, which is like a tiered approach to competencies of people can do.
Funnily enough, I would take this framework and just to make it would just be all of them listed, and you can have your supervisor or a representative from the membership body. You can produce evidence and say, oh, I presented at so-and-so conference and write, 200 words about it or something. Or, I read this research paper or wrote a research paper and stuff like that. And then you get assessed against that competency and deemed that you've achieved it. So then you don't have to be in column C. Everybody has an opportunity in the progression of their career over years to be able to be assessed against competencies they choose to.
Which opens it up also beyond the idea of this core training or whatever. Actually, it's all the different things we do as therapists and different avenues where we could evidence that.
Yeah. And it allows progression within the field, in the sense of if something crops up in a few years' time that actually all therapists need to be competent, we don't know what's going to happen in society or whatever around a particular area, then everybody has the opportunity to achieve that competence and work towards it and evidence it, and you get picked off it, you've done it.
I think that would really help the employer as well, to actually have some foundation, and so it not be thrown on them as an employer, having to make up their own competency framework. So I think that could be challenged, which is fine for it to be challenged, but I don't think therefore there'll be consistency across the board. So I like the idea of a professional body having a framework, but something that's really inclusive and equal across the board.
Yeah, because you don't all have to be assessed against the same thing. You can pick and choose depending on your own CPD and stuff like that. But it's still evidence that there's a broad brush of everybody being on the same level.
And I think the difficulty with that is obviously going to be making sure that everybody is happy with how those competencies are worded and what is included within them. And obviously, we were talking about earlier different modalities saying, actually, you're not including me in that. How you know, all of a sudden those group of people are excluded because that is not something they do within their approach. But yeah,
it's relatively simple to do if some thought goes into it as well. So I've done it before. So, yeah.
This has actually been really interesting, this question, because, I mean, Erin, by the way, I think you explained that really, really well. I'm just thinking of all the people here today as well, you know, and the different confusions. I mean, like Andy, I'm a long-term therapist. I'm not accredited through choice. There's a reason for that. So I have anxieties about, well, what does that mean now? And then, you know, Erin gave an example there of being a master's level student, qualified, and wondering about the difference between the hours that they ask for, and then in column C, and the fact that you've actually got a level 7 qualification. In fact, I think probably all of us are educated to a certain level. I think there's probably at least one doctor here who might be appearing on column A, at least maybe. So there seems to be, in this kind of, I think there's kind of agreement here that this idea of core training just being it seems to be in some ways problematic and very, very confusing. So maybe looking at, you know, what else, whether it's even pre-therapy stuff, or experience in therapy, and how that can be looked at.